It's a little late in the day for me to be starting one of these. It's about 17 after 4 in the afternoon, but my two long-awaited antiquarian volumes have come in the mail and everything else was prepared and it's all fresh in my mind. So I think I'm going to go ahead while I kind of have everything. Let me put the keyboard over here. These antiquarian volumes were not in the best of shape. The spine on this one was just flaking off. It was so fragile that you touch it and a piece would like come off. So I've used Elmer's glue on this inside where you can't see it. And I don't know what that does to the value of these things. I'll never sell them, so it's not an issue of trying to resell them and having to be honest about that. This one the cover was coming off, so I put some archival tape on that. It is archival. I made the decision to kind of follow that protocol. And as far as Elmer's glue is concerned, I have a lot of respect for Elmer's glue because when I was a kid, I used to go visit a mansion called Vizcaya. It used to belong to John Deere of the tractor fame. And there was a guy standing on a ladder, if I remember correctly. Why he was standing on a ladder, I don't know, but he was repairing a vase. And, he had the pieces and he was very carefully fitting it together. And I was very impressed. I watched and I said, well, what are you using? I thought it was some very exotic glue. And he said, well, basically it's Elmer's glue. He said, woodworking glue. So ever since then, I have not been afraid to use good old Elmer's on a thing like this. Anyway, what we're going to do is a little fancy detective work today. I'm going to follow the trail that I recently went on. And I'm going to go in the order that I went, which is the way that I wrote my books, my two large research books. I told the story of the research and followed the research so that people could go back and see exactly how I derived at what. Because I wanted to be transparent and I wanted there to be a completely transparent trail of how I got my outrageous results, And that's not why I started doing it. I started doing it just to be rigorous so people could go in behind me and see what I did. But it was essential that I did that when I started finding things that are outrageous, seemingly outrageous. So you can see how I got there. So this is going to be an example of how I get from point A to point B. I have already talked about and read some of a poem called The Beautiful. And I just realized I don't have something in front of me, so I'm going to go out and with the magic of editing, I will be right back. And I'm going to get that album. Okay, here we have this album that Mathew signed in 1851, May of 1851, because he signed it that way. And this is coming apart on the inside. There's no really easy way for me to fix that, but I'll show you what the page looked like. It's fading rather badly. Let's see, there you go. I think you can see it. Mathew's signature's on the bottom with the date. But I have a Xerox of it, which is a lot easier to see because it's fading so badly that I'm afraid it's going to be gone by the time anybody's interested in it. So I went ahead and Xeroxed it, or printed it out rather. So I found this poem in the album. Mathew put his name under it. It's ambiguous as to whether he was signing the poem or whether he was signing the album. And when I looked it up by Googling the interior lines, I found that it was attributed to a Reverend E.H. Chapin. And I think I've gone into his history a little bit. If not, it's not really important. He was a Southerner who ended up in Boston. And once he was in Boston, he started preaching liberal causes like abolition and so on, anti-slavery. A good guy. And Mathew glowingly reviewed him more than once, 3 times, I think. Reviewed his talks and praised him very highly. So Mathew thought very highly of the guy, quite likely knew him personally, I would guess. So it made sense that Mathew would quote him, but it sounded like Mathew, the poem sounded like Mathew, and I thought it was his at first. It was one of these things where I had to reluctantly let go of it and say, oh, okay, I guess there was somebody else that could write in the same style as well as Mathew did. But then I got into the 1838-1839 Portland transcript online. And this is something I've also shared. And I found a number of poems. Some were signed F. Some were signed, or their poems and essays signed with is asterisk or variations on his asterisk star signature, which he'd been using that since 1830. This was 1839. He was using it, and that was very shortly before he was signing as F in the dial, which people think was Margaret Fuller. It's like a year and a half, something like that before. So I've been through all of that. But while I was going through these poems in the Portland transcript, I found one called Consolation. And I said, my gosh, this reminds me of something. I couldn't think of what it reminded me of. And I could almost kind of think of the first few lines. So Consolation starts out, "Oh, what in a world like this is found, when the once free heart is by sorrow bound, when the brightest joys have changed to gloom, and memory lingers at the tomb, when the fondest hopes lie buried there, and pleasures of youth have turned to care. Oh, what is found in a world like this to raise the soul to its former bliss?" Well, you catch the meter on that. This is written undoubtedly in grief for his son, Joseph, who had died at 11 months old, August 4th or August 5th of 1838. So this is March 23, 1839. So it had only been a few months, and he was writing this in grief for his son. But, that's a pretty distinctive style. It probably has some technical name that I'm not aware of. There may be other poets who have written in that meter and in that style. I don't know. I don't know how common it is. But I said, boy, Matthew wrote something else in that style. What was it? And I kind of remembered the first few words, and I searched and searched and searched through my entire database, and I couldn't find it. Then it hit me. I said, oh, that's the one attributed to E.H. Chapin, which I didn't digitize because I thought it was E.H. Chapin's poem. And then I found those lines. And the ones that Matthew quoted start out, "Oh, not in the outward world alone may the beautiful be to the soul made known. In its own far depths, in its inner life, silent and pure is the spirit rife. Seen in the love that is still the same in the captive's dungeon, the martyr's flame." Now, if you've forgotten Consolation already, I'll read the first part of that one. "Oh, what in a world like this is found, when the once free heart is by sorrow bound, when the brightest joys have changed to gloom and memory lingers at the tomb." It's the same meter, the same style. That got me thinking, because this has happened several times when I felt that something was Matthew's poem. I look it up, it's attributed to somebody else, and I let it go. I believe that, and I say, oh, I was wrong, and then it starts to bother me, and I think, I don't think I was wrong. And then I look to see if there's some possible way out of this that shows that it was actually Matthew's poem in the first place. So thankfully, we have the internet today. A scholar of the past would not have had this. So we have some material by Matthew, which is very similar, which we'll get into, similar not only in meter, but also in subject matter, because you have this poem, The Beautiful, and it talks about the ocean. It talks about flowers, which I understand that Abby particularly loved flowers, and it talks about the stars. She loved the stars. She wrote about them. Whenever Matthew writes anything that's a secret tribute to Abby, the stars are in there. There's poems that talk about them walking under the stars, and, she had a mystical interpretation of the stars. So, that's in here. And then this is not only a deeply spiritual poem, it's a mystical poem. Now, a mystic believes in the truth of manifestation, and the Western mystics have put it as above, so below, which is to say that this world is a reflection of the higher world. The higher world is real, more real than this world. Okay? This is not only the veil of tears, but this is a world of illusion. The higher world is more real, the world of ideas and ideals and archetypes. That's a mystic. A mystic also believes that you can experience God in this very life. You can experience the truth within in this very life. You don't have to wait until after you die. So this poem, The Beautiful, was written by a mystic, and we'll see why I am convinced of that a little later on. It's hard to know exactly how to get into this. There's so many pieces of it. So we have the album with a portion that Mathew wrote. I'm going to carefully put that up here on my little antiquarian basket. And then we're going to look at the October 5, 1839 Portland transcript, which I've shared before. I'll turn it to where hopefully the reflection isn't so bad. On the back is a star-signed piece. I think you can see the star, but I'll put it on the screen. Entitled Beauties of the Material World. And this is essentially an essay covering the same insights that this poem covers, except that this was published on October 5, 1839, which is before the earliest that the poem, The Beautiful, comes out, as we'll see. So this came first. So did Consolation, which was March 23, 1839. So my guess is that Mathew wrote the poem, The Beautiful, in 1839, along with these other ones. So I'm going to read just a little bit again of this Beauties of the Material World. This, again, was written by a mystic from a mystical perspective. Let me go into it a little bit. How infinitely indebted is man to the God of all nature for that mind which enjoys, which sees and feels this beauty. What would man be without the pleasant and delightful objects of nature? Where would be the rapture, the adoration which her works now excite in him? Deprive the material world of beauty, and you wrong the immortal mind. You give an offense for which no recompense can be made, while the mind dwells in clay. But the question returns, what would beauty be without the mind? And he goes on like that. He says, what is beauty in the material world? Every rational being knows and rejoices in the knowledge, but who can tell? What is its color? Is it the glossy black of the raven or the snowy white of the swan? So he's saying that the opposites all reflect the archetypes, and they're all beautiful because they all carry God's beauty. Okay, so that is the as above, so below perspective. And I could show you more to demonstrate that that's really in there, but it's in there. It's also in this poem, The Beautiful. Now keep in mind that Edward H. Chapin is he's a sincere Christian, but he's not a mystic. You know, he's a traditional Christian. There's no reason why we would expect mysticism from this man based on what I've seen. Also, he wrote sermons, he wrote essays, he was an excellent speaker. He traveled the country apparently speaking. Mathew covered his speeches 3 times. But he wasn't really a poet. The only thing I could find of his that was a book of poetry was a book of hymns, which he wrote with somebody else. We don't know how much was his contribution. And they're very nice hymns. They're not mystical. They're devotional. They're, they talk about the congregation and everybody worshiping together and that kind of thing. I haven't read them in great depth. But the gist of it is there's nothing in this style, first of all. And it's not really by a mystic per se. So it's a mismatch, the attribution to Chapin. There's one biography of Chapin that quotes a little bit of his poetry. It's pretty good. None of it's in this style of The Beautiful. And then there's another biography, and the only poem it quotes is, and I've got my notes here somewhere, he wrote a poem when he was a boy called The Ocean Buried. And it went through a whole bunch of different permutations when different people got through with it. Finally, it ended up as the song, Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie, which you may be familiar with. See, that was his. And his poem as a boy didn't show a whole lot of promise, in my opinion. So, it's okay. It's good, sentimental stuff. Now, there are 2 published instances, which I have here, 2 published instances of this poem, The Beautiful. The first one that I found, which was the second one to be published, was in an Oddfellows publication. And it's actually this one. It's an Oddfellows publication called The Gavel. I got to be real careful with this because I just taped the spine, the outside of the spine was just flaking off. So I'm not even going to show you the cover to it, but it's the Gavel, and it's a periodical. And there is one piece, the unsigned piece, that I believe is by Mathew earlier on in this, but we are now in the April 1846 edition of the Gavel. And a fellow named William H. Herbert writes an article entitled The Genius and Eloquence of Chapin, which I won't read for you, but he gets here to an example of one of Chapin's best poems, which happens to be The Beautiful. And he says, as by way of introduction, with his rich mind and glowing fancy, Chapin would doubtless have arisen to a high rank among poets had leisure been afforded to him for more important things for the culture of that gift. So what he's saying is he's not known as a poet, and he's speculating that Chapin was capable of writing poetry of this quality, which I don't think is true at all. I think he was he could give sermons and he could write essays and he could give talks. He really wasn't a poet, and he didn't set himself out to be a poet. And he says, we have at hand a poem from his pen, which is perhaps equal in true merit to any poem written in our country, with the exception of Thanatopsis. He writes it Thanatopris, but it's a mistake. And that's William Cullen Bryant's poem, or the Psalm of Life, which is Longfellow's poem. So he's comparing him to William Cullen Bryant and Psalm of Life by Longfellow, but he's basing it on this poem. So he's really comparing Mathew Franklin Whittier to these two poets. He just doesn't know it. This is how all of this mess got mixed up, because Mathew hid himself. And so people just supplied whatever they thought was the truth. See, it's understandable they did this. Now, this is the first example of the beautiful that I found, but there are little mistakes in this. Okay, it's first off, it's truncated. The end of it, which is the most mystical part of it, was cut out. Secondly, there are two errors, and they're telling errors. They're errors that indicate that the person that made this error didn't understand the poem. In particular, he didn't understand the mysticism of the poem, but whoever made these errors didn't understand it. And they were prudish, possibly. So the first one, which I'll put up on the screen, he says, "Oh, calm they slumber, the battle brand has crumbled away from the sailor's hand, and his look is unruffled and passionless now, and open and fair as that infant's brow, whom the mother keeps clasped to her pulseless rest." That's the way this reads. It's supposed to read, "to her pulseless breast," which we'll see when we see the earlier printing. Okay, so he's taken the word breast and somehow put in rest, and it rhymes with rest. So, whoever copied this over cared so little about poetry that he used the same word to rhyme it, because the next line is, "through the long still hours of that ocean rest." So he didn't like breast. It offended somebody. And then a little further down on the third stanza, where it talks about the stars, at the end it says, "as things untarnished and bright and high, and it yearneth and hopeth from them to soar when it looks through these fleshly bars no more." That's how it's supposed to read. But in the Gavel, it reads fleshy bars, F-L-E-S-H-Y. Well, fleshy means fat. I used corpulent in my book, as a nicer term. But in other words, they're saying that he's looking through fat bars. So he didn't even pay attention. Whoever copied this didn't really pay attention and didn't understand the poem. I've run into this in other cases. There's a whopper of a clue in The Lost Bower that's supposed to be by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. That's going to be in my article. I won't give it away here. There's another one like that I've run across in the literature. So then, if that wasn't enough, we get to this part that was cut out completely at the end, the mystical part. And I have that marked here. So the end of the poem in the Gavel is the same as the portion that Mathew copied over in the album, except that he left out the next to last line. So it reads, "by chisel uncarved, by poet unsung, in orbs like yon bright ones that silently roll, The beautiful lives in the depths of the soul. And then it goes on. And it says, there's not much of it. I'm going to read the whole thing. They only who know it, its presence who feel, through the outward, the inward and true can reveal. For them is a meaning in ocean and flower, and the coarsest has beauty, the weakest has power. Thou, by whose fiat all beings have life, and each in its season with beauty is rife, the glories beneath, the glories above, interpreters are of thy wisdom and love. May we read them, their pages are glowing and free, and learn from the lessons of duty and thee. May our spirits be pure, their innermost strings in harmony tuned to all beautiful things, bringing forth evermore in the depths of the soul, in order and light, like the planets that roll, the thoughts and affections that in them should be, the love for mankind and the service of thee, the efforts and labors of duty sublime, all of them beautiful, each in its time. I got chills reading that. I hope you did. I didn't want to stop, but I'm like, you know, this is the mystical perspective. And this is something that I had felt and known that Abby taught Matthew. You can go out in nature and all the wisdom, it's like a book. It really is a book. You go out and you can see the principles that apply to man's life and his relationship to God are all there. For example, the saints talk about humility as being like water. They compare humility to water that is lowly and chaste and pure and adapts itself to any vessel, you know, and is always of service, you know, and so on. Well, those lessons are there because as above, so below. So what's below is reflecting what's above. What's above is not only beautiful, but it's full of wisdom. So the wisdom of the higher spheres is reflected in nature. See, Darwin's selection by survival of the fittest is a materialistic monster because it cuts out all of this, see? So this was written by a mystic, and bless E.H. Chapin's heart, he was not a mystic and he was not a poet. So it's very implausible for him and entirely plausible for Matthew, who was being coached by Abby. And the two of them were writing these things together in as much as he would show them to her and she would make suggestions, you know, and so on. So they're really collaborations, just as they did with A Christmas Carol. And this is the same period of time that they would have been collaborating on A Christmas Carol, which also carries the same inspiration from higher spheres, which Dickens could not possibly have written. Now, you know, I'm going to emphasize that Dickens may have been smart. He may have had a gift. He may have been a competent writer. He was not a mystic. He did not have inspiration from the higher realms. And A Christmas Carol manifestly does, even what's left of it. And he could not have written it. Now, this is a little book. It's a compilation of poems into which the editor inserts some of her own because she's also a poet. And I guess, you know, if you want to publish your poetry, you can publish a compilation of poems and include your own in there. You know, I don't mean to be too cynical, but this is called The Rose of Sharon. And this was the third edition, an annual edition in 1842. It's called A Religious Souvenir for the year 1842, edited by Miss Sarah C. Edgerton in Boston, published in Boston in 1842. And at the very, 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 very back, the very last poem of this entire volume is The Beautiful, which presumably, there it is, dyslexia is getting me again, presumably this is the complete version. Now, how she got it, I don't know, but there's some clues here because in terms of probabilities, I'm guessing it somehow got to the editor late. That, you know, because they didn't have random access in Microsoft Word back then, you know, and when everything was set to print and somebody came rushing in with another piece to add on, it had to go in the back, I'm assuming. So I'm guessing that this poem came in at the last minute. I think that Reverend Chapin was probably a very well-organized fellow. He ran a church. He gave talks. He was an intelligent man. I don't think he would have submitted a poem of this quality at the last possible second, to where they had to put it in the back. This is extrapolation, but I'm just running some detective logic through this. So however this came to the editor's attention, it was attributed to Reverend Chapin, not necessarily by him, and it came in late at the last minute. And it was so good that she couldn't leave it out, Somebody said, oh, look, I have this poem that I think is by Reverend Chapin, or what I'm guessing happened was that Matthew gave him a copy, just like he gave a copy to Edgar Allan Poe. I think he would give copies of his unpublished work to people. Well, Chapin, I think, was honorable, as opposed to Edgar Allan Poe, who was not. And Chapin probably passed it along to someone else, or copied it over for someone else and said, I have this wonderful poem I'd like to share with you. And he might have, his tongue was tied. He could not say whose it was because Matthew would swear people to secrecy. Okay? So he couldn't say, that it was Mathew Franklin Whittier's. He probably did not say it was his. He just left the whole thing, unsaid and said, here's a poem that I think is really wonderful. I'd like to share with you. And the recipient or the next recipient or the next recipient believed that it was Chapin's because the third guy says, oh, I got this from a guy who got it from Reverend Chapin. So by that time, it's now identified as his. So the third guy rushes in to Miss Edgerton and says, look at this wonderful poem that was written by Chapin. Well, Chapin was famous, or well known anyway. And so this was a plum to have a poem of this quality written by this guy who was quite well known. Definitely they would want to put it in. So stop the presses. We're going to put this on the back. That's my guess. But here we have the whole thing. And I'm guessing that Matthew saw it and wrote a letter and a nice letter and said, how did this happen? And Reverend Chapin says, oh, I'm sorry. So I shared it with a couple people and one of them must have assumed that I wrote it. And Matthew's like, that's fine. Because at least it's attributed to a nice guy, to an upright person. So it's not like the Raven or especially Annabel Lee being attributed to a thief like, Poe. So he just let it be. But I'm saying that this is definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier's poem. And it is, as Mr. Herbert suggested, it's right up there with Thanatopsis and what was the other one? Psalm of Life by Longfellow. It's right up there with William Cullen Bryant and Longfellow's work. Now, let's suppose that I'm right about this. I'm convinced of it. Other people may not be, especially cynics. I don't count cynics because cynicism shuts off your brain. Cynicism is like a toxin that shuts off your ability to discern the truth. You can only see one thing at that point. It's like filters that let you only see one color, red, and nothing else. So the cynics don't count as far as, whether this is valid or not, honestly. The people that count are the people that are open-minded and take it into consideration and go through the same logical process I do, and they may agree and they may not agree. And, I respect those kind of opinions. I don't respect cynicism. I feel sorry for cynicism. I've been there, I understand it, but I don't respect it in the sense of taking it into account, Let's suppose that this really was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. And it's excellent poetry. It's mystical poetry. It was written probably in collaboration with Abby. It's just not known as his because he kept very quiet, a very low profile. That's the only reason. There's nothing outrageous at all about positing that Matthew and Abby could have written the original of A Christmas Carol. This is what I've been trying to get across to people, is that it's not really outrageous. The reason it seems outrageous to you and to everybody else is reputation, okay? Because That book has been called the greatest little book in the world, if I remember the quote correctly. It's world famous. It helped to make Dickens world famous. Everybody has been taught since knee high to a grasshopper that that was written by Charles Dickens. It almost comes out, the name A Christmas Carol and Charles Dickens come out together like a sneeze, like a reflex. But there's no objective reason, given all this evidence that I have, given the evidence of the quality that Matthew and Abby were capable of writing at, and the inspiration that they were clearly able to express. There's no reason why they couldn't have been the authors. There's no reason why that has to be outrageous. Then I've got other evidence, a lot of other evidence, and that's all in that magazine article in Real Paranormal Magazine, which is on the virtual shelves as we speak. I think it's $6, $7, something like that. It's not terribly expensive. It's on Kindle. You go to my updates page and you can find the link for it on Amazon. Or you can wait another 3 weeks and I will be giving the link to Academia EDU, where I'm going to repost it. And that's when I'm going to start sending out personalized emails to 530 university professors. I only found 2 in Australia. You know, it was interesting. Some of these universities really want you to meet their faculty, and they make it easy. Once you get into the English department's website, it's right there, meet our faculty, or our people. Others make it very hard, and some of them don't have any way to see them at all. Some of them just have a list with an email, but there's nothing about them. It's widely variable, and it also varies by country. The United States university websites are much easier to find the faculty than the British ones. The British ones are like pulling teeth to find them. They're in there, but boy, you got to know what you're doing to get in there, and sometimes it takes a good 5 minutes to find them. And then once you go through them all, there's almost none of them that are interested in a relevant topic. And what I noticed was that just because they're interested in the period doesn't mean that they're amenable to this or have any real interest in A Christmas Carol, because somebody can be interested in 19th century literature, and turns out what they're interested in is, I don't know, skin. Skin diseases in the 19th century as reflected in literature. That's an extreme example, but, just all kinds of things. Anything you can think of that you might be interested in today, they projected it onto the 19th century, and that is their interest. Could be political, could be health related, could be anything. So, I had to read these things, and I get all excited. This person's into the Victorian literature, and I say, they're into the fingernails in the Victorian literature, or children's rights, or animal rights, or, any number of laudable things, not always trite, but they would have no interest in who wrote A Christmas Carol. So that narrowed it down quite a bit. I had to find somebody that plausibly was interested in some angle of it. Some people were interested in the history of books and authorship. Well, that's a good one. Some people were interested in the Christmas Carol itself. Some people were interested in Dickens, but didn't mention that. So if it was, was somewhere in the ballpark, I would put them in my list. If they were too far off, I would just go past them. And even then, I might get 1 per university if I was lucky. If I got into a big university, I might get 2. It was about like that. So, I went through a whole lot of websites to do this. It took me several days, a week or more. And the majority of them, the vast majority of them, won't look at it. Of those that look at it, most of them will get offended the first 1/4 of it, as I've said, because that's the part that talks about how Dickens could not possibly have written A Christmas Carol, which he couldn't have. And some of them may read the whole thing. Now, what I wanted to say and didn't quite articulate the last time I talked about this, the reason that the editors of Real Paranormal Magazine put my fizz, as Matthew used to call a face, next to Dickens' fizz on the cover was because they were forced to read the whole article. They had to read it because they had to key it in, and they had to read the whole thing to see what they were putting in their magazine. So they had to read it. And as a result of being forced to read the article, they saw that I had real evidence. Very few other people, I think, will read the whole article. I look at these videos and my documentary as well, and you can get into YouTube and look at the stats, and you can see how long the average person watched. You're talking 6 minutes or an hour show. The average person only watched 6 minutes. Well, averages are a little tricky because somebody might have watched the whole thing and somebody might have clicked out at 3 seconds. But basically, just because somebody clicks on your link does not mean that they watched your presentation. I would gather that's the same way with the videos that I've made about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven. I don't think anybody's watched all the way through, so they haven't really seen the evidence. And it's going to be the same way with this article. A small fraction of people will start reading it, and most of them will not read the whole thing. So very, very few will actually see the evidence. And it's good evidence. I've spent a lot of time with this, and it's also one of the best pieces I've ever written in this lifetime. I made sure it was well worthy of Mathew and Abby's literary abilities, which I still have, amazingly. I don't think I could write. I can't write as easily as Mathew did. He was like a font of creativity, like an overflowing, sparking font of creativity. He could just generate new ideas like that. And people would get famous picking up the crumbs that fell off his table, metaphorically. He would get an idea, he would work with it a little while, and then he'd get bored with that and he'd go on to a completely fresh idea. Meanwhile, his imitators were busy beating the first idea to death while he was already off on the second one. See? It's an amazing, interesting history. Well, I don't have that, but under pressure, if I really have to, I can rise to the same level. And I think what I'm going to do here is put a graphic showing the date for the blog entry, the written blog entry, where I wrote that parody of Edgar Allan Poe's philosophy of composition, because I'm proud of it. I think it's as good as any satire Mathew ever did. And I think, again, it was Mathew's talent that welled up in me and kind of took over. And I was able to write that to the same level of satire that Mathew did. Now, Mathew studied the best satirists of the English, 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, whatever he could get his hands on. He studied all the best. And he really wanted to go into that field. He made it a life's work to write satire, social commentary and satire. So for me to get an idea and execute it as well as what he did, that's past life memory. That's past life memory talent, every bit as much as the cases that Dr. Ian Stevenson came across, where somebody knew how to repair a milk machine because he'd done it in his past life, or somebody knew a song or a dance that was not part of her current culture as a child that she remembered from the previous culture. And if I remember correctly, there was one little girl that remembered this dance, and she got it about 85, 90% right. She made a few mistakes, but basically it was all out of memory, out of past life memory. Well, my writing, when I am really pressed, I can do that. I can call up Mathew's writing ability. I've done it with poetry to Abby, and I did it with this little satire. So I will put up on the screen what that link is. And I suggest you check it out. Don't get offended because, the little boy is supposed to be crass, because Poe was crass. For all of his highfalutin intellect, he really was a crass, worldly, selfish person. And that's why I've got this little boy as a crass, selfish, worldly little boy running parallel in his little paper to the philosophy of composition, which is sheer bullshit. That philosophy of composition was all pulled it out of, we will say, out of the air. Okay. Some professors had picked up on that and they think it was a parody. They don't think it was serious. Well, it wasn't serious because he never wrote The Raven. So he was laughing up his sleeve, I think, as he wrote it. But it wasn't a parody in the sense of trying to illustrate any noble principle, which is what real satire does. He was just laughing up his sleeve because he knew damn well he hadn't written the poem. See, and he thinks he's so smart that he's going to fool everybody. Well, he didn't. He didn't even fool some of the, he didn't even fool some of the scholars, but they haven't really figured out that he never wrote The Raven, and it was all just like damage control to show that he could have written it. It was a big blustery show, see. Well, that's for later, because my next paper, which, let's see, our deadline is June 2nd for Real Paranormal Magazine. That means that it'll probably come out mid-July, I'm guessing. That's when the paper on Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven comes out. There I have even stronger evidence than I had for A Christmas Carol. I mean, the more I looked into it, the more I found, until it was just like, I say it's like a football game where one team just runs up the score. I got 63-7 or something, I kept finding it, and I kept documenting it. More and more evidence came in, and I just kept documenting it. And even things that people thought were going to disprove my case, like philosophy of composition, ended up working for me because it's real. So because it's real, no matter how much evidence you get in, it's going to end up working towards that end, because that's the truth. Well, anyway, I have some archival, real appropriate archival plastic to create covers for these. That should be coming in the next few days. It's actually somewhere very far north in Maine, of all things. I forget the name of the town. It's like as far north in Maine as you can go, in a little town that's got about 2,000 people. That's where the plastic is coming from. So when that gets here, I'm going to put these in their appropriate covers. And spring is definitely sprung. My tree out front is getting little buds. So spring is starting up here in Maine just now. If I was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where I was before, basically the show is over, there. But here we have it to look forward to. When it gets warmer and it's a nice, dry, warm, pleasant day, I'm going to take a bunch of original material, I think, like these books. I'm going to go to Evergreen Cemetery, which is about 5 minutes from here. I didn't know that when I rented this attic apartment. And I'm going to go to several of the graves that are important in Matthew's life, several of the people that were important in Matthew's life. I'm going to sit in front of those graves with my cell phone. I've got a little pole, and I'm going to read the things that are relevant. There's a letter that Matthew wrote to his son. I'll read that in front of his son's grave. There's his second wife's grave. And I've got stories that he shared with B.P. Shillaber, that Shillaber wrote up about Blifkins the martyr. I'll read one of those in front of her grave. There's a beautiful little poem to his daughter Alice, whose nickname was Allie. And her grave is there jointly with her husband, Wilbur Barry, and Alice Barry. So I'll read the little poem to Allie in front of that one, and so on. I've got a very cool story by, I believe it's in this edition of the Portland Transcript, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Yeah, in the October 5th, 1839, it says The Boar's Back by Charles P. Isley. I'm gonna take this with me. I'll put them all in the car and take them out one at a time, I think. And I'm going to read that in front of Charles Isley's stone, and so on. I might or might not get through it all in one trip, but I think that would be kind of fun. So that's about all. I tend to ramble on and drag these out and not know quite how to close them, but I am going to close this one. I hope some of you are finding this enjoyable. Some people apparently are either threatened or just very unpleasant and leave some very unpleasant comments. Again, I answer them not for that person, but for anybody else that might be reading. But apparently there's some people that are more receptive and more supportive and are enjoying these. So I'm doing these for you, of course. And there's all kinds of possibilities. One thing I thought I might do, one of the earliest videos I did was to play on my piano some of the music that Abby used to play for Matthew from the original books. One of them, Abby might have even played from herself. And I did a horrible job of it because I get so nervous in front of the camera and I just blank. I go deer in the headlights and I can't remember how to play, and it's just awful. What I thought I'd do is just sit down with my webcam and just play for an extended period of time until I can get a little further on. Maybe my nerves will settle down and I can get one that's pretty good pass, and you'll get a better sense of what some of those songs are like. I think a couple people appreciated the music, but I just did such a terrible job of playing it, and I can play much better than that. I'm not a good pianist, but Abby has been teaching me. And how she teaches me is through prompting. And one of the interesting things she wants me to do, it's very awkward because my interpretation of her telepathy is not that good. I mean, we're soulmates. All soulmates are telepathic. That's the basis for the communication. I'm not psychic. So I can get her prompting. And one of the things she wants me to do is when I learn a passage and I play it successfully, she says, stop. Let that success sink in, and it'll cook on the back burner. And when you come back, you'll be able to play that, and it works. We're talking like 5-10 minute practices, mini practices. And I think that has to do with my own capacities and my short-term memory and whatever else. But if I practice until I get frustrated, I'm not going to learn. If I practice until I get something new and I got it, she says, stop, let that sink in. I've never heard any other piano teacher do that. Piano teachers are usually getting paid, for a certain length of time, and they can't do that. But it's an interesting technique, and it actually seems to work. So maybe someday I'll set up the webcam and I'll sit over there and I'll just play until the nerves are gone and I can actually, play some of these properly. We'll see about that one. That's for the future. So once again, I've dragged this out long enough. Thank you for watching.